Sometimes a child does not cry when she is hurting. Sometimes she adjusts her posture, lowers her voice, and decides the weight is hers to manage. Sometimes the world assumes that resilience means silence, that strength means endurance. And sometimes the most dangerous mistake adults make is believing a young girl will carry pain quietly because she has always been capable. They believed time would teach her to adapt. They did not realize her father was already watching. Daniel Whitmore had built his life around precision. As a senior compliance consultant for a regional healthcare network, he spent his days evaluating policy gaps, reviewing internal investigations, and ensuring systems followed the rules they claimed to uphold. He understood how institutions protected themselves long before they protected individuals. At home, however, he was not clinical. He was steady. His calm presence anchored the Whitmore household, creating a space where nothing had to be exaggerated to be understood. Evelyn Whitmore softened that steadiness with intuition that felt almost instinctive. She noticed tone shifts in conversations and changes in breathing patterns at the dinner table. Where Daniel analyzed, Evelyn sensed. Their partnership was quiet but deeply aligned, built on shared respect and unspoken coordination. Their daughter, Lila Whitmore, had inherited both strengths. She carried her scholarship at Briarwood Academy with disciplined pride, aware that she had earned her place without legacy advantage. Briarwood was the kind of institution families spoke about with careful admiration. Its ivy-covered buildings stood as monuments to achievement, and its alumni lists were filled with judges, executives, and public figures. Reputation at Briarwood was currency. Standards were sacred. Lila had thrived there during her first year. She brought home academic certificates folded neatly in her backpack, mentioned debate victories with understated excitement, and described her classes with thoughtful curiosity. She did not boast, but she glowed with quiet satisfaction. The shift began so subtly that even Evelyn almost missed it. Lila stopped mentioning small victories. A returned essay with high marks remained inside her folder instead of on the refrigerator. A successful group presentation was summarized in a single sentence rather than shared in detail. Her smile still appeared at dinner, but it lingered less. It no longer reached her eyes in the same effortless way. Daniel noticed the timing before he noticed the expression. The change began shortly after mid-semester evaluations were distributed at Briarwood. There had been no alarming grades, no disciplinary notice. Yet something beneath the surface felt altered. At dinner one evening, Evelyn described an upcoming community fundraiser and asked casually about Lila's literature project. Lila answered politely, her tone measured, offering just enough detail to appear engaged. There was no irritation, no visible distress, only restraint. Daniel watched her hands as she spoke. They rested folded in her lap, rather than moving with emphasis, as they once had. He noticed how she glanced down briefly before responding, as if selecting words carefully. It was not dramatic. It was almost invisible. Something feels off. He did not say it aloud. Briarwood Academy maintained a culture of polished excellence. Its newsletters celebrated student achievements with curated precision. Its counselors emphasized emotional wellness alongside academic rigor. Families trusted its leadership implicitly. When minor social conflicts arose, they were handled quietly, framed as growth opportunities. Lila had always navigated social spaces thoughtfully. She was not the loudest student, nor the most visibly competitive. She had built friendships slowly, choosing connection over popularity. Yet over the past weeks, Evelyn noticed fewer weekend study sessions. Invitations that once arrived regularly seemed to taper off. When asked gently whether anything had happened, Lila offered a reassuring shake of her head. She described school as busy. She attributed her quieter mood to workload. There was no complaint in her voice, no accusation against anyone. Daniel understood that children who endure emotional pressure rarely announce it immediately. They adjust first. They internalize. They attempt to correct themselves before questioning others. He reviewed Briarwood's academic calendar that night, noting the timing of advisory meetings and faculty evaluations. He did not search for scandal. He searched for sequence. Evelyn entered the kitchen after Lila had gone upstairs and leaned against the counter, her expression thoughtful. She felt it too, the subtle distance in her daughter's voice, the slight tightening around her eyes. But she also sensed Lila's determination not to worry them. That restraint, more than any visible sadness, unsettled her. Upstairs, Lila sat at her desk under the soft glow of a lamp, completing assignments with methodical focus. Her posture was straight, her breathing steady. She was not unraveling. She was enduring. Daniel stood outside her bedroom door briefly that evening, listening to the quiet rustle of notebook pages turning. He considered knocking, asking directly what had changed. But something in him held back. He understood that premature confrontation could push her deeper into silence. If something larger was unfolding at Briarwood, it would not reveal itself through accusation. It would reveal itself through pattern. He returned to the kitchen table and opened his laptop, not to draft emails, not to challenge administrators, but to begin observing. He reviewed Briarwood's publicly available policies on student conduct and peer mediation. He bookmarked scholarship guidelines. He made no assumptions. At breakfast the next morning, Lila offered a thin but sincere smile. It was enough to reassure anyone who was not looking closely. Daniel looked closely. Hidden emotional pain rarely announces itself with drama. It whispers through restraint, through withheld joy, through effort that feels slightly heavier than before. He did not ask her what was wrong that night. He decided to watch first. Sometimes the harm does not come from what is said directly. It comes from the story built quietly around someone while they are still trying to understand their own confusion. Sometimes adults speak softly enough that doubt sounds reasonable and concern sounds compassionate. And sometimes a child's strength is reinterpreted as fragility simply because it is convenient. They did not accuse Lila Whitmore outright. They adjusted the narrative until it no longer resembled her. The email requesting a meeting arrived on a Wednesday afternoon, framed as a routine check-in. Briarwood Academy valued holistic development, it explained. The counselor wanted to discuss adjustment observations and ensure continued student wellness. The tone was polished, measured, almost nurturing. Evelyn read it first and felt a familiar tightening in her chest. Daniel read it next and noted the phrasing. Adjustment concerns. Observations. Wellness alignment. Words chosen carefully enough to imply something without declaring it. The meeting took place in a sunlit office overlooking the campus courtyard. The school counselor, Dr. Miriam Ellison, spoke gently about transition periods and the pressures scholarship students sometimes carry. She referenced subtle peer tensions that had been brought to her attention, though she did not specify names or incidents. She described Lila as bright, thoughtful, but possibly overly sensitive in social dynamics. The phrase lingered in the air longer than it should have. Administrators framed the discussion around resilience. Briarwood, they explained, encouraged students to adapt to complex social environments. Academic excellence required emotional balance. The school's reputation depended on students who could represent it with confidence. The word reputation surfaced lightly, as if by accident, yet it carried weight. Scholarship recipients, they added, were ambassadors of the Academy's values. There was no formal documentation presented. No written complaint was placed on the table. No incident report was shared. The conversation relied on generalities, on impressions, on carefully structured concern. Evelyn listened with composure, her hands folded in her lap, absorbing the tone more than the content. She heard the suggestion beneath the words that Lila might be misreading peer interactions, that perhaps her sensitivity was creating misunderstandings. It was subtle, almost persuasive. A child's pain reframed as personal limitation rather than external behavior. Daniel watched closely. He noticed how the counselor avoided concrete examples. He observed how administrators nodded in coordinated rhythm when resilience was mentioned. He recognized the pattern, softened the framing, emphasized growth, suggest responsibility without issuing accusation. Something feels off. He did not interrupt the flow of conversation. He asked measured questions instead. Could they clarify the specific peer conflict referenced? Had formal mediation occurred? Were there written concerns available for review? The answers remained gentle but noncommittal. The academy preferred to address matters informally first, they explained. They believed in proactive support. The suggestion that scholarship status could be influenced by holistic assessments surfaced only briefly, almost as an aside. Yet Daniel heard it clearly. Briarwood maintained high expectations for its representatives. Stability mattered. Alignment mattered. Nothing had been decided, of course, but evaluations were ongoing. Fear rarely needs to be loud when implication can do the work. Lila sat beside her parents, her posture composed. She listened as adults discussed her resilience, as if it were under review. She did not defend herself. She did not challenge their descriptions. Instead, she absorbed the subtle message that something about her response to peer dynamics might be flawed. The shift in narrative was not dramatic, but it was powerful. Pain reframed as weakness. Discomfort reframed as oversensitivity. After the meeting, Evelyn noticed the difference immediately. Lila walked more quietly through the hallway, her steps measured. She thanked the counselor politely before leaving, her voice steady. But her shoulders seemed to carry something heavier than before. In the days that followed, social distancing began to take shape. A friend who once sat beside her in literature class moved to another table, citing group project alignment. A study session proceeded without her inclusion. Conversations lowered slightly when she approached. No confrontation occurred. No open exclusion. Just recalibration. Within parent circles, subtle language shifted as well. Evelyn overheard a remark about helping scholarship students integrate socially. The phrasing sounded supportive, yet it implied adjustment on Lila's part. Reputation management works best when it spreads through suggestion. Daniel began mapping the sequence of events in his mind. The meeting, the emphasis on sensitivity, the immediate social shift. He reviewed Briarwood's published guidelines on peer conflict mediation and student conduct. Nothing aligned with the vagueness of the conversation. If formal concerns existed, policy required documentation. Yet none had been provided. He did not confront the school immediately. He did not escalate emotionally. Instead, he observed patterns in communication. He noted how often resilience was emphasized in follow-up emails. He archived every message. He recorded dates. Evelyn focused on Lila's emotional state at home. She created space for conversation without forcing it. One evening, she gently asked whether anything specific had happened with classmates. Lila hesitated before answering, choosing her words carefully. She described feeling misinterpreted during a group discussion, sensing tension she could not fully explain. She wondered aloud whether she had reacted too strongly, whether she needed to adjust. Guilt had begun to take root where clarity should have been. Daniel listened without interrupting. He did not dismiss her feelings, nor did he validate the school's framing. He simply absorbed the information, recognizing how quickly narrative can reshape self-perception. By the time the meeting ended, the story about Lila had already started spreading. Isolation does not always arrive with cruelty. Sometimes it arrives politely, disguised as scheduling conflicts and shifting priorities. Sometimes it sounds like kindness while slowly removing belonging. And sometimes the most painful part is not what is taken away, but the quiet expectation that a young girl will adapt without complaint. They believed Lila would adjust. They believed she would carry the discomfort quietly. They believed endurance was the same thing as healing. The shift unfolded gradually across Briarwood Academy's carefully maintained hallways. No one confronted Lila directly. No one accused her openly. Instead, friends who once lingered beside her locker now seemed preoccupied, their conversations redirected before she could join. A study group that had met weekly rearranged its roster without explanation. When she asked gently about the change, the response was courteous but distant, referencing group chemistry and new alignments. Group projects were reassigned under the language of academic balance. Teachers explained that rotating teams fostered adaptability, yet Lila noticed she was often placed with students who approached her cautiously. The comfort she once felt collaborating with familiar faces dissolved into careful politeness. Invitations disappeared quietly. A weekend gathering was mentioned casually in class without prior notice. A debate practice session occurred without her inclusion. There was no hostility in anyone's voice, but there was absence. Faculty tone shifted in ways subtle enough to escape formal complaint. A literature instructor, who once praised her thoughtful analysis, now emphasized brevity and emotional regulation. A history teacher reminded the class about maintaining perspective during disagreements, his glance lingering slightly longer on Lila than on others. Nothing explicit, nothing documentable, just suggestion. Pain reframed as oversensitivity had begun shaping perception. Lila absorbed the changes inwardly. She replayed conversations in her mind, analyzing her own words for possible missteps. She adjusted her tone during discussions, speaking more cautiously, smiling more often even when uncertain. She volunteered less, worried that enthusiasm might be misinterpreted. She shortened her responses, trimming passion into neutrality. Guilt took root quietly. At home, she remained composed. She completed assignments diligently, her academic performance steady. There was no dramatic breakdown, no tearful confession. Instead, there was a gradual thinning of light behind her eyes. Evelyn sensed it during quiet moments, while folding laundry together, while clearing dinner plates. Lila moved through routines with discipline, yet something inside her felt heavier. Daniel observed exhaustion in ways others might miss. He noticed how Lila lingered longer in the shower, as if gathering strength before facing the next day. He saw how she reviewed messages twice before responding, measuring each word. He recognized the posture of someone attempting to correct a narrative they did not create. Isolation through implication is powerful because it leaves no clear enemy. Briarwood's administration did not issue new warnings. The counselor did not request immediate follow-ups. The narrative simply settled into place. Within parent circles, Evelyn heard references to supporting students who struggle socially. The phrasing was sympathetic, yet it reinforced a quiet conclusion. Adjustment was Lila's responsibility. One afternoon, Evelyn watched Lila decline an invitation to a weekend outing with a soft explanation about workload. It was not that she had not been invited. It was that she no longer felt certain she belonged. Avoidance can feel safer than rejection. Daniel resisted the urge to confront the academy prematurely. He understood that without documentation, the pattern would be dismissed as perception. He continued observing. He reviewed Briarwood's peer mediation policies again, noting the absence of any formal complaint involving Lila. If peer conflict existed, it had not followed procedural pathways. The emotional endurance expected of her unsettled him most. Children are often praised for resilience, without acknowledging the cost of carrying unaddressed pain. Daniel refused to let quiet suffering become normalized. One evening, he found Lila sitting at the dining table long after homework was complete, staring at an open notebook. Her posture was straight, but her shoulders seemed tense. He sat across from her without interrogation, offering presence rather than pressure. They spoke about an upcoming literature exam. She answered calmly, her voice steady. Yet beneath the steadiness was fatigue. Evelyn joined them, placing a gentle hand on Lila's back. The touch lingered just long enough to communicate understanding. They did not force disclosure. They did not dramatize the moment. They trusted that patience would create space. Days passed with the same restrained rhythm. Lila adjusted her behavior further, reducing visible emotion in classroom discussions. Teachers interpreted the change as improvement. The subtle blame narrative had worked. Compliance often looks like growth. But Daniel knew the difference between adaptation and suppression. He continued documenting shifts in tone and sequence. He archived emails. He noted how quickly social distance followed administrative conversation. He mapped the timeline carefully, building clarity where ambiguity had been weaponized. Then, exactly 1 week after the counselor meeting, an envelope arrived in the Whitmore mailbox bearing Briarwood Academy's crest. It was not an invitation or a newsletter. It was formal, structured, deliberate. The first written report arrived a week later. Some documents do not simply record events. They reshape them. They take moments that were once ordinary and rearrange them into something heavier, something charged with implication. And sometimes the most unsettling realization is not that a report exists, but that it tells a version of the truth you no longer recognize. They believed the paper would settle the matter. They believed ink carried more authority than memory. The envelope from Briarwood Academy was heavier than the usual correspondence, sealed with institutional certainty. Daniel placed it on the kitchen table without ceremony, yet the room seemed to tighten around it. Evelyn stood beside him, steady but alert, sensing that whatever lay inside would require patience rather than panic. Lila watched from a distance, her expression composed, though something in her posture suggested she already knew this was not routine communication. The report inside was structured and polished, labeled as a formal behavioral summary. Its language was professional, almost gentle in tone, yet the implications carried weight. It referenced ongoing peer disruption concerns, described heightened emotional responses during collaborative settings, and suggested that Lila's interactions had contributed to tension within her academic cohort. No names were mentioned. No direct incidents were outlined with clarity. Instead, phrases like pattern of sensitivity and difficulty integrating perspectives appeared repeatedly. The events described were not entirely fabricated. They were reframed. A group discussion in literature, where Lila had expressed strong interpretation of a character's motivation, was presented as intensity disproportionate to context. A disagreement during a history debate became escalation of emotional tone. Each moment, once small and human, was reinterpreted through a lens of instability. The narrative did not accuse her of misconduct. It questioned her balance. Scholarship review was referenced carefully in the final paragraph. It noted that while no immediate action had been taken, continued concerns might necessitate evaluation of alignment with institutional standards. The phrasing was controlled, deliberate, and heavy with suggestion. Emotional pressure rarely needs direct threat. Evelyn read the document slowly, her eyes moving carefully across each paragraph. She felt the sting not of accusation, but of distortion. It was not what had happened that unsettled her.
It was how it had been arranged.
She could sense the weight this narrative might place on Lila's self-perception if left unchallenged. Lila stood quietly, her gaze lowered as her father read. She did not interrupt. She did not defend herself. Yet inside, something shifted. Seeing her everyday moments described as problematic forced her to question memory itself. Had she been too forceful? Too expressive? Too earnest? The report's polished tone made doubt feel reasonable. Daniel read the document twice before speaking. His face remained calm, his breathing steady. He did not allow the language to provoke visible reaction. Instead, he placed the pages beside his laptop and opened the digital archive he had been building since the first meeting. He began with timestamps. The report claimed that faculty observations had accumulated over several weeks prior to the initial counselor meeting. Yet email correspondence from that period contained no indication of concern. Teacher feedback forms from mid-semester evaluations described Lila as engaged, thoughtful, and collaborative. There was no documented transition from praise to caution. He checked the report's metadata, noting the creation date embedded in the digital file properties. The summary had been drafted before the second counselor meeting occurred. The narrative had been formalized while the Whitmores were still being reassured informally. He cross-referenced policy. Briarwood's handbook required that formal behavioral summaries follow documented incident reports and mediation attempts. No such documentation had been shared. No mediation sessions had been formally recorded. The procedural sequence outlined by policy did not align with the sequence implied by the report. Paperwork, when used carefully, can create reality. But paperwork also leaves trails. Daniel circled phrases that lacked specificity. He highlighted references to patterns unsupported by cited examples. He marked inconsistencies between timeline claims and documented communications. Each notation was quiet, deliberate, unemotional. Evelyn watched him work and felt her own fear steady into resolve. She recognized that outrage would not dismantle distortion. Precision would. Lila listened as her parents discussed the language gently, explaining how wording can alter meaning without altering facts. They reassured her not through dramatic promises, but through clarity. They reminded her that interpretation is not identity. Still, the emotional pressure lingered. The acknowledgement form attached to the report required signature within 5 business days, confirming receipt and understanding of the concerns outlined. It appeared administrative, routine. Daniel knew the difference between acknowledgement and agreement. He closed the folder carefully, his expression unchanged. He did not storm into confrontation. He did not draft an immediate rebuttal. Instead, he opened a new document and began outlining questions referencing specific policy clauses, timeline discrepancies, and missing documentation. He understood the strategy behind the report. If signed quietly, it would establish precedent. It would anchor the narrative as accepted fact. They assumed he would sign the acknowledgement form quietly. Pressure is powerful when it moves in one direction. It isolates. It reshapes perception. It convinces the vulnerable that resistance is pointless. But pressure begins to lose its certainty the moment it meets structure. The moment someone documents instead of reacts. The moment silence stops being compliance and starts becoming evidence. They believed Lila would grow tired before they did. They did not anticipate that patience could outlast authority. Daniel Whitmore did not announce his next step. He followed procedure the same way he had built his career, quietly, thoroughly, without spectacle. After drafting his formal response to Briarwood Academy's behavioral summary, he attached citations from the school's own handbook and submitted a structured procedural inquiry to the Academy's Board of Trustees. Simultaneously, guided by a consultation with an education compliance advisor, he notified the regional accreditation oversight body responsible for reviewing institutional adherence to student conduct standards. There was no dramatic escalation, no public statement, no accusation of wrongdoing, only documentation. The oversight body responded within a week, acknowledging receipt of the inquiry and requesting additional materials from Briarwood Academy. The language was neutral and administrative, yet its implications were significant. What had been framed internally as a matter of student sensitivity was now categorized as a question of policy compliance. Within the Academy's administrative offices, tone began to shift. Internal emails that were initially withheld during earlier discussions were now requested under formal review. Threads referencing risk mitigation, scholarship optics, and narrative stabilization surfaced in response to oversight inquiries. These phrases, once casual within closed systems, carried different weight under examination. They revealed that the behavioral summary had been shaped not solely by concern, but by strategic positioning. The risk management language exposed something subtle but critical. The Academy had anticipated reputational complications before confirming factual consistency. The narrative had been designed to prevent disruption rather than address it. Daniel reviewed each newly disclosed document with calm concentration. He cross-referenced timestamps, noting that certain administrative discussions about behavioral alignment occurred before any documented peer mediation attempts. The sequence contradicted Briarwood's stated commitment to restorative practice. Evelyn read portions of the emails with quiet disbelief, not in anger, but in sorrow. She saw how easily perception had been curated. She understood that institutions often prioritize stability over individual clarity. Yet she also felt a growing steadiness. Evidence was replacing implication. Briarwood recalibrated. The proposed scholarship review meeting was formally paused pending completion of the independent oversight evaluation. Communication from administrators became carefully structured, each message reviewed by compliance officers before being sent. The language softened further, emphasizing cooperation and transparency. At school, the social atmosphere began to adjust. Faculty members who had once adopted cautious distance returned to neutral engagement. A literature teacher invited Lila to contribute to an upcoming academic panel, framing it as recognition of her analytical strength. The invitation was simple, unceremonious, yet it signaled a subtle restoration. Peers, sensing administrative uncertainty, recalibrated as well. Conversations resumed without the guarded tone that had once lingered. Study groups opened naturally again. The unspoken assumption that Lila was overly sensitive began dissolving without direct confrontation. Power structures rarely collapse loudly. They destabilize quietly when accountability enters the room. Behind closed doors, Briarwood's legal counsel advised administrative restraint. Policy revisions were drafted preemptively, clarifying documentation requirements for behavioral summaries and reinforcing mediation protocols. The Academy understood that oversight findings could influence accreditation standing if procedural gaps were confirmed. Yet there was no public spectacle. No announcements were made. No assemblies were called. The shift unfolded beneath polished surfaces. Parents received newsletters emphasizing the Academy's commitment to process integrity and student well-being. The language was broad enough to avoid direct reference, yet specific enough to signal awareness. At home, the Whitmores remained composed. Lila continued attending classes with measured confidence. She did not celebrate the shift in tone. She noticed it quietly, allowing herself to breathe a little more easily in classrooms that once felt heavy. Daniel maintained routine. He updated his documentation archive, recording every new development without triumph. He understood that vindication was not the objective. Restoration was. Evelyn observed Lila one evening as she worked at the dining table, her posture less tense than it had been weeks before. The subtle light had returned to her eyes, not because the conflict was dramatic, but because the burden of unchallenged narrative had eased. The Academy had expected fatigue. It encountered structure instead. The oversight body completed its review more quickly than anticipated. The evaluation focused not on punishing the Academy, but on confirming adherence to stated policy. Documentation discrepancies were acknowledged. Recommendations were issued. The scholarship review remained paused. On a quiet Sunday evening, Daniel received an email notification indicating that the independent review findings would be formally delivered the following day. He closed his laptop without visible reaction, though he understood the weight of what was coming. The independent review findings were delivered on a Monday morning. Pressure is powerful when it moves in one direction. It isolates, it reshapes perception, it convinces the vulnerable that resistance is pointless. But pressure begins to lose its certainty the moment it meets structure. The moment someone documents instead of reacts. The moment silence stops being compliance and starts becoming evidence. They believed Lila would grow tired before they did. They did not anticipate that patience could outlast authority. Daniel Whitmore did not announce his next step. He followed procedure the same way he had built his career, quietly, thoroughly, without spectacle. After drafting his formal response to Briarwood Academy's behavioral summary, he attached citations from the school's own handbook and submitted a structured procedural inquiry to the Academy's Board of Trustees. Simultaneously, guided by a consultation with an education compliance advisor, he notified the regional accreditation oversight body responsible for reviewing institutional adherence to student conduct standards. There was no dramatic escalation, no public statement, no accusation of wrongdoing, only documentation. The oversight body responded within a week, acknowledging receipt of the inquiry and requesting additional materials from Briarwood Academy. The language was neutral and administrative, yet its implications were significant. What had been framed internally as a matter of student sensitivity was now categorized as a question of policy compliance. Within the Academy's administrative offices, tone began to shift. Internal emails that were initially withheld during earlier discussions were now requested under formal review. Threads referencing risk mitigation, scholarship optics, and narrative stabilization surfaced in response to oversight inquiries. These phrases, once casual within closed systems, carried different weight under examination. They revealed that the behavioral summary had been shaped not solely by concern, but by strategic positioning. The risk management language exposed something subtle but critical. The Academy had anticipated reputational complications before confirming factual consistency. The narrative had been designed to prevent disruption rather than address it. Daniel reviewed each newly disclosed document with calm concentration. He cross-referenced timestamps, noting that certain administrative discussions about behavioral alignment occurred before any documented peer mediation attempts. The sequence contradicted Briarwood's stated commitment to restorative practice. Evelyn read portions of the emails with quiet disbelief, not in anger, but in sorrow. She saw how easily perception had been curated. She understood that institutions often prioritize stability over individual clarity. Yet she also felt a growing steadiness. Evidence was replacing implication. Briarwood recalibrated. The proposed scholarship review meeting was formally paused pending completion of the independent oversight evaluation. Communication from administrators became carefully structured, each message reviewed by compliance officers before being sent. The language softened further, emphasizing cooperation and transparency. At school, the social atmosphere began to adjust. Faculty members who had once adopted cautious distance returned to neutral engagement. A literature teacher invited Lila to contribute to an upcoming academic panel, framing it as recognition of her analytical strength. The invitation was simple, unceremonious, yet it signaled a subtle restoration. Peers, sensing administrative uncertainty, recalibrated as well. Conversations resumed without the guarded tone that had once lingered. Study groups opened naturally again. The unspoken assumption that Lila was overly sensitive began dissolving without direct confrontation. Power structures rarely collapse loudly. They destabilize quietly when accountability enters the room. Behind closed doors, Briarwood's legal counsel advised administrative restraint. Policy revisions were drafted preemptively, clarifying documentation requirements for behavioral summaries and reinforcing mediation protocols. The Academy understood that oversight findings could influence accreditation standing if procedural gaps were confirmed. Yet there was no public spectacle. No announcements were made. No assemblies were called. The shift unfolded beneath polished surfaces. Parents received newsletters emphasizing the Academy's commitment to process integrity and student well-being. The language was broad enough to avoid direct reference, yet specific enough to signal awareness. At home, the Whitmores remained composed. Lila continued attending classes with measured confidence. She did not celebrate the shift in tone. She noticed it quietly, allowing herself to breathe a little more easily in classrooms that once felt heavy. Daniel maintained routine. He updated his documentation archive, recording every new development without triumph. He understood that vindication was not the objective. Restoration was. Evelyn observed Lila one evening as she worked at the dining table, her posture less tense than it had been weeks before. The subtle light had returned to her eyes, not because the conflict was dramatic, but because the burden of unchallenged narrative had eased. The Academy had expected fatigue. It encountered structure instead. The oversight body completed its review more quickly than anticipated. The evaluation focused not on punishing the Academy, but on confirming adherence to stated policy. Documentation discrepancies were acknowledged. Recommendations were issued. The scholarship review remained paused. On a quiet Sunday evening, Daniel received an email notification indicating that the independent review findings would be formally delivered the following day. He closed his laptop without visible reaction, though he understood the weight of what was coming. The independent review findings were delivered on a Monday morning. Justice does not always arrive with thunder. Sometimes it arrives in a quiet email, attached as a formal PDF, written in measured language that carries the weight of correction without the drama of accusation. Sometimes accountability is not loud enough to satisfy anger, but steady enough to restore truth. And sometimes the most powerful moment in a long struggle is realizing that dignity survived intact. They believed the system would protect itself. They did not expect it to correct itself. The independent review findings were delivered in a structured report that left little room for interpretation. The oversight body confirmed procedural failure in Briarwood Academy's handling of Lila Whitmore's case. The behavioral summary, it stated, had been issued without proper documentation of mediation attempts and without adherence to stated policy timelines. Faculty observations cited in the report lacked formal incident records. The sequence of administrative actions did not align with the Academy's published guidelines. The language was calm, neutral, and precise. Most significant was the conclusion that the behavioral narrative presented to the Whitmore family was unsupported by documented evidence. While minor peer disagreements had occurred, They fell within normal student interaction patterns and did not justify escalation to scholarship review consideration. The implication was clear without being inflammatory. Perception had been elevated to process without foundation. Daniel read the report carefully, his expression unchanged, though something in his shoulders eased slightly. Evelyn sat beside him, absorbing each sentence not as triumph, but as validation. Lila listened quietly as her parents summarized the findings in gentle, reassuring terms. She did not smile immediately. Relief takes time to register when doubt has lingered. Policy reforms were required as part of the oversight recommendations. Briarwood was instructed to revise its documentation procedures, ensuring that formal behavioral summaries could not be issued without recorded mediation efforts and parental notification. Training sessions for faculty on conflict resolution and narrative neutrality were mandated. These changes were not framed as punishment. They were presented as institutional growth. Internally, accountability measures unfolded with quiet discretion. Administrative roles were adjusted. Review protocols were clarified. Language used in scholarship evaluations was tightened to prevent subjective interpretation from influencing status considerations. There was no public scandal, no press release, only internal recalibration. The scholarship review that had once hovered as a threat was formally closed. A written confirmation arrived stating that Lila's scholarship remained fully secure, unchanged, and in good standing. The letter was straightforward, almost understated, yet its simplicity felt restorative. It did not apologize. It did not dramatize. It corrected. Reputation, once subtly compromised, began restoring itself without announcement. Faculty engagement with Lila returned to its original tone, respectful, attentive, academically focused. Peer relationships stabilized. Invitations resurfaced naturally. The quiet distancing that had once surrounded her dissolved without acknowledgement, as if the atmosphere had decided to recalibrate on its own. Daniel chose dignity. He did not request a public apology from Briarwood's administration. He did not forward the oversight findings to parent networks. He did not recount internal emails that had revealed risk management strategies. He understood that humiliation would not strengthen the system. It would only fracture trust further. Instead, he accepted the Academy's compliance updates with composed professionalism. In a final meeting with the headmaster, he acknowledged the importance of procedural integrity for all students, not just his daughter. His tone was steady, his words measured. He sought assurance, not vindication. Evelyn felt something soften within her during that meeting. Not forgiveness in a dramatic sense, but release. She realized that holding resentment would tether them to a chapter already closing. Grace did not mean forgetting. It meant refusing to let anger define the ending. For Lila, confidence did not return in a sudden wave. It rebuilt itself quietly. She began raising her hand in class again, without hesitation. She contributed to discussions with the same thoughtful intensity that once felt misinterpreted. When invited to participate in a debate panel, she accepted without overanalyzing the decision. Her posture straightened not because she had been declared innocent, but because she no longer felt questioned. Emotional healing began not in confrontation, but in restoration of rhythm. The Whitmore household felt lighter in the evenings. Conversations returned to future plans rather than procedural timelines. The HR archive remained stored away, not destroyed, but no longer actively expanded. Documentation had served its purpose. Justice delivered cleanly leaves space for growth. Daniel reflected quietly one night at the kitchen table, recognizing that silence had been misunderstood from the start. It had not been passivity. It had been preparation. He had refused to let his daughter internalize a narrative shaped by convenience. He had refused to allow implication to become identity. Briarwood continued functioning with its polished exterior, yet beneath that surface, processes had tightened. Accountability had entered the structure and done its work without spectacle. Lila's smile, once thinner and restrained, returned with warmth that felt genuine again. It was not naive. It was resilient. But the real healing did not happen at school. Some wounds do not leave visible marks. They settle quietly inside a child and convince her she must be stronger than her years. Some burdens are handed down not through cruelty, but through silence, through the expectation that endurance is maturity. And sometimes the most powerful act of love is not fighting louder, but stepping in before a child decides the weight is hers to keep. They thought Lila would learn to carry it alone. They did not understand that her father had already chosen otherwise. The real healing began not in Briarwood's offices, but in the Whitmore living room on a quiet evening when the house felt safe enough for truth. Daniel asked Lila to sit with him, not for interrogation, not for correction, but for conversation. His tone was gentle, measured, free of urgency. He did not begin with policy or procedure. He began with her worth. He told her that perception can shift, but identity does not. He explained how institutions sometimes protect order before they protect individuals, and how that misalignment says more about structure than about character. He reminded her that passion is not instability, that conviction is not weakness, and that disagreement does not require apology when delivered with respect. His words were steady, not dramatic. He did not elevate himself as hero. He positioned himself as witness. Lila listened quietly at first, her composure familiar. But as Daniel continued, something inside her loosened. The guilt she had been carrying, quietly, privately, began to surface. She admitted that she had started questioning her own reactions, that she had wondered whether she was too intense, too expressive, too different. She had tried to shrink herself just enough to avoid being misread again. Evelyn moved closer, her presence warm and grounding. She placed her hand gently over Lila's, not to interrupt, but to anchor. The room felt still in a way that allowed honesty to breathe. There were no dramatic tears, no raised voices. Just a slow release of tension that had built over weeks. Daniel listened, without correcting her feelings. He did not dismiss her doubt. Instead, he reframed it with clarity. He explained how narratives can be constructed around convenience, how subtle suggestion can influence self-perception. He made it clear that her value had never been under review, even if paperwork had implied otherwise. Guilt began to give way to understanding. Lila realized that her attempts to adjust had been rooted in fear, not in growth. She had confused endurance with responsibility. Hearing her father articulate what she could not name allowed something inside her to settle.
She did not need to prove she was balanced.
She needed to remember she already was. In the weeks that followed, boundaries were established quietly and permanently. Daniel ensured that all future communication with Briarwood remained documented. Policy updates were acknowledged in writing. Transparency became expectation, not request. There was no hostility in his tone, only clarity. The institution corrected its internal narrative, refining language and reinforcing mediation processes. Faculty training sessions emphasized neutrality in behavioral reporting. The academy moved forward, wiser and more careful. But within the Whitmore home, something deeper had changed. The family emerged stronger, not because they had won a battle, but because they had remained aligned through uncertainty. Claire's steady intuition had been validated. Daniel's patience had protected without spectacle. Lila's resilience had matured into self-awareness rather than self-doubt. Silence, they realized, is not the same as endurance. Silence can be strategic. Endurance, without support, can become isolation. The difference lies in whether someone is watching closely enough to intervene. Daniel reflected often on how easily a child can internalize blame when adults frame discomfort as oversensitivity. He understood now more than ever that parental vigilance does not require confrontation at every turn. It requires attention. It requires the willingness to observe before reacting and to act before damage settles permanently. Lila returned fully to herself. Her smile regained its warmth. Her voice carried thoughtful conviction again. She participated in discussions without trimming her ideas to fit invisible expectations. She mentored a younger scholarship student quietly, offering reassurance about belonging and perspective without recounting her own experience in detail. Acceptance replaced bitterness. The Whitmores did not carry resentment into the future. They carried wisdom. They understood that institutions are imperfect, that perception can distort truth, and that protection sometimes requires patience more than force. One evening, months later, Lila placed an academic award on the mantel without hesitation. The gesture was small, almost ordinary. Yet it symbolized something profound. She was no longer shrinking herself to avoid misinterpretation. Daniel watched from across the room, not with pride that demanded recognition, but with quiet gratitude. He had not fought loudly. He had not sought applause. He had simply refused to let his daughter believe she was alone. They believed she would carry the pain quietly. They believed time would make her adjust. They underestimated the man who was watching, and she never had to carry it alone again. If this story resonated with you, if you believe that children deserve protection, that dignity matters more than noise, and that patience can be stronger than power, stay with this channel. Stories like this remind us that quiet strength changes outcomes. Share your thoughts in the comments, because your voice might encourage someone who feels alone tonight. And if you value stories rooted in resilience, grace, and accountability, consider subscribing so you never miss the next reminder that love, when steady, always shows up in time.